Yeah, I'm taking Leaves of Grass to the little free library right away because I'm just not here for the rupee core-like level of depth in this exercise in free association. And I'm also not here for this Murica drivel in the gospel thingy at the beginning. Bye bye, Leaves of Grass. Good morning, guys. This was originally supposed to be a cozy weekend reading vlog of the weekend from the 12th to the 14th of February, so at the tail end of the cold front here. However, it ended up being a pretty meh reading weekend, and accordingly the footage turned out pretty meh, and I ended up deleting most of it except for what you just saw. So I thought I'd turn this into a slightly vlogish recent reads kind of wrap up. So the book that I read that weekend and that turned out to be rather underwhelming was A Place Called Winter by Patrick Gale. This is the novelized story of the author's great-grandfather's life. At the beginning of the 20th century, his great-grandfather, Hare, had an affair with a man which was discovered by his brother-in-law. He was by then married with a daughter who would become the author's grandmother. But the brother-in-law forced him to leave the country in order to preserve the family's good name, and he emigrated to Canada and became a homesteader in Saskatchewan. And this is the story of his life there and how he built his farm and the story of his love life, which was naturally complicated. I'm afraid this didn't convince me as a novel. I think it would have worked better as narrative nonfiction, or if the author had taken some more liberties with the story. Because you see, a life, if it isn't interpreted very skillfully and very emphatically, is just a sequence of events that don't necessarily add up to a story or a plot. But a historical novel kind of needs that. The author did try to give the story some narrative cohesion by embedding it into a frame narrative, also taken from the story of his great-grandfather's life. But there doesn't seem to be any real point to this structure, and it promptly dissolves towards the end. So I was hugely underwhelmed by this and unconvinced by it as a novel. I think I was generous in giving it 3 stars on Goodreads, and I did so mainly because I thought that there was enough in here that was beautiful and hinted at a skilled storyteller, enough that I'm willing to give Patrick Gale another chance and see what he does when he doesn't restrict himself to an already preconceived storyline. I actually found another novel of his in a little free library last year. Let me get it. This is Notes from an Exhibition, the story of a dead artist's life, I think. And I might also have bought used copies of A Perfectly Good Man and Rough Music. All of these, I think, are set in Cornwall. And this past week, I've also been reading When We Were Orphans by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is a novel with a narrator with a very peculiar voice, which started out as this very quiet personal drama. and is now about to widen in scope dramatically to encompass more or less the whole world. I'm very much looking forward to talking about this sometime in the next couple of days. It is now Sunday, and this morning I read the last 30 pages of When We Were Orphans by Kazuo Ishiguro. And it was just as heartbreaking as you'd expect from an Ishiguro novel. It gave me the same feelings of creeping despair and of claustrophobia as The Remains of the Day, and it has a lot in common with that novel in general. This is the story of Christopher Banks, an Englishman who grew up in Shanghai and lost both his parents when he was 10 years old in Shanghai around the year 1910. Lost, quite literally, they just vanished within a month of each other and were never found. Christopher was then shipped to England, where he had an aunt, and went to boarding school to Cambridge, and then became a famous detective, a private investigator, after the fashion of Sherlock Holmes, a profession which he had been working towards ever since his parents vanished. And he solved some famous cases in London and all around England, but of course at the back of his mind there has always been this one big unsolved mystery of what happened to his parents. And in the course of the novel he is going to go back to Shanghai eventually, and when he does, it will be right at the eve of the Second World War and at the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War. But although there is a war going on, and at one point the protagonist will find himself right between the fighting lines, this is a very quiet and slow-moving novel, as you would expect from Ishiguro. By far the most striking thing about this novel is the voice of the narrator. I don't really like the term unreliable narrator because it gets thrown around so much and it doesn't really say anything. It doesn't really tell you anything about what's going on with the narrator. It's just the result of what's going on with them. The thing with Christopher Banks as a first-person narrator is that in order for him to be able to cope with the horrifying manner in which he lost his parents, who were just taken from him from their own home in Shanghai, in order to be able to cope with that, his brain and his memory have created these elaborate fantasies for him to live and to act out. And that affects both the past and his memories of his life in Shanghai and the present, because while he does seem to be a capable detective and he did solve some cases, he isn't regarded nearly as uniformly as a brilliant genius as he would like to believe. But he is oblivious to that, and in his imagination he is, and he was always going to go back to Shanghai at some point and solve this old cold case and bring back his parents, and everything will be all right. And this sandcastle that his brain has been building for him even affects or informs his writing style. His style is extremely stilted and formal. It is reminiscent of John Watson's writing style in the Sherlock Holmes novels, but it's even more formal. And that is to some degree because of Christopher's history as an expatriate who went back to England and was afraid of not seeming English enough, or that he would stand out from the crowd because of his mannerisms that weren't completely English and of his style of talking, and so he overcompensated and became overly English in an overly formal way. But it also acts as a shield. It makes sure that he doesn't have to do emotions, and it also keeps you at a distance. And it also discourages disagreement and criticism, or even just questions, because it makes him seem so self-possessed, so self-assured, and so sober. It is the voice of somebody who knows exactly what he is doing and who sees through everything and understands everything. So of course he is right in everything that he says and does. That does sound a lot like the butler in The Remains of the Day, doesn't it? And there is also one particular element in this novel that reminded me of another novel by a different author, but I can't tell you what it is because it would be a little bit spoilery. But if you have read this book, I would love to chat with you about it and see if you think that this is a coincidence or that it might actually have been inspired by that novel. I'd really like to discuss this issue. Anyhow, I enjoyed this a lot, and I thought that it was an extremely compelling read. But you shouldn't go into it expecting a crime thriller or a war novel. But if you've read any Kazuo Ishiguro whatsoever before, then I'm sure you won't make that mistake anyway. I am now about to go out for a walk through the park. It's an unseasonably warm and sunny weekend, and I'm going to get some sunlight onto my skin. And the book that I'm going to take with me is definitely not the joyful and light read that you'd normally pick up to go with weather like that. It's The Ordinary Person's Guide to Empire by Arundhati Roy. This is a collection of articles and lectures by Arundhati Roy from the early 2000s, the early noughties, and they are all about power and oppression in a global context. The empire in the title is not, as you might expect from an Indian author, is not the British Empire, but in fact the American Empire. Yes. I'm going to talk more about it once I've gotten through it, but it is every bit as urgent and as honestly gut-wrenching as all of Arundhati Roy's nonfiction that I've read so far. I've already quoted it in the opening sequence of this video, but I'll read you the quote again. She says, "Fiction and non-fiction are only different techniques of storytelling. For reasons I do not fully understand, fiction dances out of me. Non-fiction is wrenched out by the aching, broken world I wake up to every morning." And that is exactly what it feels like. And with that little motivational quote, I'm going to leave you for the rest of the weekend. It is Wednesday the 24th, and I have finished The Ordinary Person's Guide to Empire. I said that this was about the American Empire, and it is. It's about American foreign policy in the early noughties. But in a broader way, and in Arundhati Roy's own words, Though it might appear otherwise, my writing is not really about nations and histories, it's about power. About the paranoia of power and ruthlessness of power, about the physics of power. I absolutely loved this collection, just like I've loved everything that I've read by and listened to from Arundhati Roy before. She is like, not to pit the two against each other, but she is like Noam Chomsky with feeling. Not in the sense that she appeals to emotions rather than intellect to achieve what she wants to achieve, or that she persuades rather than convinces, but in the sense that she gives the topic that she talks about the urgency that they deserve, and she shows like no other the true human cost of these things, which to most of her audience happen on the other side of the world, and or to people who are often regarded as less than human. For me, with nonfiction like that, there is always the question, do I keep the book in order to have a reminder of these things, and because it's so quotable, or do I put it somewhere like in a little free library where somebody else might pick it up who isn't yet aware of these things? But then again, it might get picked up by somebody who ends up never reading it, or they do read it but they are not convinced, and it might end up doing more harm than good. So I never know. What do you do with nonfiction like that? Pray tell. Good news, guys! I saw the cranes fly today, and that means it's officially spring. The cranes always spend the winter month on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea in Spain or in southern France, living their best life. And then for the summer they fly north to Scandinavia or even northern Germany. And that means we see them fly over Germany twice a year. And for me, it's always officially the change of the season when I see them fly. But I almost forgot that I also read another book earlier this week. It was a short romance novella by Harper. The title is Priddy's Tale, and that's a totally funny and clever pun because this is a mermaid story, or a merman story rather, because it's a male-male romance. And if perchance you were thinking, well, merman and mermaid romances aren't really my thing, but Harper is such a good author, and almost everything that she writes, and in particular all the characters that she writes, are always so emotionally affecting and seem so genuine that I am willing to give a merman romance a chance, even though under normal circumstances even just the thought of it would make me cringe. If you're thinking that, maybe reconsider, because this one is totally cringy as they get, or as I imagine that they can get. Because it's not like I have a large text base for comparison. And on top of that, I'm afraid I just didn't believe the romance either. It was insta-lovey and implausible, and I just didn't see it. That's just me, obviously, but some of the negative reviews that I've read say the same thing, so it's not just me. Hi guys, it is Saturday the 27th and I finished one more book this week, and that is the classic Gothic tale The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, which was published in the year 1898. It's the story of a young woman who takes on the position of governess in a big English manor house, where she has to supervise two small children under the age of 10. And she is the one who is in charge in the manor house. There is some staff there, but not a lot. The children are orphaned, and their uncle, who has hired her, lives in London and doesn't want to be burdened with any questions to do with the children and the house. And at the beginning, there isn't a lot that the governess could even burden him with, because everything is fantastic in the beginning. The children are a dream. They are both so gentle, so well behaved, they are downright angelic, and they could do no wrong. But it doesn't take long for things to go downhill, because very soon the governess starts to see ghosts. And the ghosts are, of course, a threat in and of themselves, and a potential threat to her precious young wards. But a few weeks later, the governess begins to suspect that the children are not just aware of the ghosts, even though they never say anything, but that they are even in cahoots with the ghosts, and that is the reason why they never say anything. And now she begins to fear for her own safety, and very soon things escalate. But we never really learn what actually happens, because this is first-person narration written long after the events took place, and we only ever learn what the governess saw and thought, and what she now wants us to learn about the events. I buddy read this with Maria Hill from MH Books, and this almost went down the road of all my buddy reads, which have all been awful so far. It wasn't quite the disaster that the rest of my buddy reads were, but I wasn't convinced by it either. My problem with it was that the way it is set up, with this very unreliable narrator again, the way it is set up, I would have expected there to be more ambiguity. I expected that I would be wondering all the time what is real and what isn't, if there are really ghosts there or if there aren't, and what the governess is only imagining, and what actually happened for whatever reason, be it ghosts, or be it that somebody is playing pranks on her, or that even something darker is going on at Bly Manor, but something that is not necessarily supernatural. But for me, there wasn't ever any ambiguity there. I was convinced from about page 3 onwards that the governess was delusional, and that she was imagining everything that she saw, and that that she had some kind of mental illness that I don't presume to diagnose. I'm a complete layman in such, or laywoman in such matters, but some kind of psychiatric condition, be it obsessive compulsive disorder, or that she's just for some reason having these psychotic episodes, or maybe the way she talked about the children, there might even have been some borderline disorder in there. I don't really know. What I was sure of was that nothing about these suspicions that she had and about the ghosts that she saw had any foundation whatsoever. I was sure from the beginning that it was only in her mind, from the very beginning. So there wasn't even a gradual revelation of untrustworthiness of the governess. It was clear to me just from the very beginning, and that made it a somewhat boring reading experience, because there was never any progression, never any, well, like I said, revelation. It was just all the time me thinking, oh bitch, please. Not what you want to be thinking while you're curling up with a hopefully cozy Gothic ghost story. The one positive thing that I can say was that I thought it was quite impressive to watch somebody this delusional pursue her delusions in such an obsessive way. However, like I said, I would have preferred it if it had been a little more ambiguous in the beginning. So that was quite disappointing, and I just thought of another negative thing that I could say about it, and that is that the voice of the governess, the first-person narrator, isn't authentic at all. It is Henry James's voice all the way through, not the voice of a young and only mildly educated governess. So that was disappointing and frustrating to read as well. I hope that at least Daisy Miller, the other tale in this book, is a little bit more worth my time. Otherwise, I will be really angry at myself for spending the money on this new edition. However, I am enjoying all the books that I'm reading at the moment very much, and I want to take this opportunity to just quickly mention one of them, and that is The Watchmaker of Filigree Street. I just don't know if I'll get an opportunity to mention it in another video in the future, because I'm not going to do a review video of just this book, because it's a little bit too well known for that, I think. This is the first novel by Natasha Pulley, whose third novel, The Bedlam Stacks, I discussed in depth in a review video. And this is again a historical novel. It's set in London and Oxford in the 1880s. It's historical, or rather para-historical, or historical fantasy if you like, but the fantasy elements are so few and unobtrusive that I'd rather call it para-history. It just has some steampunk elements and some other elements that weren't like that in the 1880s in England. The book is told from two points of view, but the main character is Nathaniel Stapleton, who is a government clerk who used to have great artistic dreams but got stranded in the Home Office. And one day he is rescued from an explosion by a pocket watch, which appeared out of the blue in mysterious ways in his boarding house room. And it takes him to its maker, the watchmaker of Filigree Street. And a little bit later, after their two paths have crossed, they will also cross the path of a young woman who is studying physics at Oxford, and she is trying to find evidence of or prove the existence of luminiferous ether. This is one of the steampunk elements, obviously. I'm only just over 60 pages in, but already I can see that even though I know I will have some things to criticize again, just as I did with the Bedlam Stacks, I'm going to love this, because just as with the Bedlam Stacks, I immediately fell in love with the main character. I have just so far always been able to immediately relate to and connect with Natasha Pulley's characters, at least the ones that are supposed to be sympathetic. And that makes the books extremely compelling, because I just have to know what happens to these characters, and I have to know if they will be happy at the end. So these are all the books that I have read since we spoke last. I hope that your reading month has been successful as well, and as always, I'd love to know what you think about the books that I talked about.